There is in everybody's life an opportunity to really be blessed to meet somebody. And I have to tell you that 8 years ago when I took this job, one of the things I did was try to find out who were the nonprofit leaders in the state so I could learn from them. And I reached out to Bill Bolling, our keynote speaker today. And Bill granted me the opportunity to sit down and chat with him for, I think we had about 15 minutes scheduled. And we ended up sitting together for over an hour talking about our philosophies on collaboration and cooperation and helping people in need. And over the last 8 years, he has been a true friend and a mentor to me personally and to St. Vincent de Paul, Georgia. He's a friend to all of us. Bill is the founder and executive director of the Atlanta Community Food Bank, which he founded in 1979 here in Georgia. He oversees a food distribution network of millions of pounds of goods of unmarketable food and grocery products each year through a network of more than 600 nonprofit organizations that feed the hungry as well as provide food to other food banks throughout the Southeast U.S. Prior to his founding of the Atlanta Community Food Bank, Bill was the director of community ministries for St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in Atlanta. He has a master's degree in Master of Arts in Psychology and Counseling, has attended the Harvard Business School Strategic Perspectives course. He's an adjunct professor at Georgia Tech University, charter member of the board of directors of Feeding America, and the 2012 recipient of the Georgia Trend Magazine Georgian of the Year. So it gives me an incredible amount of pleasure to introduce to you one of the best people I know, Mr. Bill Bolling.
Thank you, John. I don't know if everybody's gotten to know John very well, but if he asks you for a 15-minute meeting, clear your calendar for the afternoon. That's my experience. John, thank you. You've been a great friend and a great leader in this city. You know, John, a few minutes ago, took a moment to thank the people that cooked our food and have served us today and are going to clean up behind us, and I want to do that too because living in Atlanta, I have a lot of meetings here at Marriott, and when I travel, I use Marriott, and it's a great company, and I think they do a particularly good job. So I hear the conference has gone well. And as we all know, working at St. Vincent de Paul, that things don't happen by accident. As John said, I began at St. Luke's Episcopal Church. John's made me an honorary Catholic. I am a fallen Episcopalian, but he said I could be part of St. Vincent de Paul, and I'm almost a Catholic. St. Luke's is just a few blocks from here. And in 1975, I was called to help feed the hungry. I started the first community kitchen for homeless people. I was a Vietnam veteran, and my focus then was to serve homeless veterans. And as you know, every war produces folks who have a hard time integrating back in. But little did I know, I thought that was going to be kind of a limited thing. I had a business degree and a teaching degree, and I'm close to 30 years old. My mother's getting worried. Bill, you don't have a real job yet. My wife and I started an interfaith community a few blocks from the church, and we lived there for 10 years and had different faith groups represented and homeless, mentally ill living with us. And I didn't know, as many of us don't know when we're young, what God would have in store for me. But as I started the ministry, and really back then the ministry of getting up at 5 in the morning and making soup for a couple of hours for 300 or 400 people, what I realized is I love to serve people. I love to make soup. I enjoyed making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And I was very successful in finding enough food to feed folks. But what we weren't successful in is feeding everybody who needed help. I know many of you may have started your work and your volunteering back in the 70s. Back then, we were the only church in town, black or white, who was serving folks. And the idea was that I'd try to get some other congregations to open their doors and feed people. We needed help. So I went around town and told everybody that I'd get them all the food they needed if they would just open the doors. Now, I will say I was good at quoting Scripture and making people feel guilty. That works. I raised a lot of money in the suburbs with guilt. I have no problem with that. I got about 30 churches, black and white churches, saying that they would open their doors to feed the hungry if I would provide them the food, which I had promised to do. The only problem is I didn't have any food or a warehouse or a truck. I just felt like there has to be some food out there because I was doing all right in my program. And that was the first kind of alliteration of what a food bank would be. And we worked through 1978. Got legal in 79, as they say, got incorporated. I didn't know anybody else doing this work, and I read about a food bank in a magazine in Detroit. And they had opened up about 3 months before me, and I thought, wow, I'd go talk to some veterans. They started 3 months before I did. I still remember flying up there, big deal for me back then, to fly up just to see a program. And what I remembered is that the daffodils were out down here and it snowed up there. But I found that there were a number of programs around the country. We didn't know each other. We didn't start together. But we found each other. Very much like you found each other this week. Many of you are long-term friends and have worked together, but many of you have met each other for the first time. It really does help in one's ministry to find soul brothers and soul sisters, soulmates that are called to the same kind of work. Now, a story that you may not know is that the first food bank in the country started, of all places, in Phoenix, Arizona. And it started out of St. Vincent de Paul Soup Kitchen. It was started by a gentleman by the name of John Van Hengel. And John was a retired, what we used to call a retired playboy. He just played tennis and volunteered down at St. Vincent de Paul. But he had the same idea, that there's got to be a lot of food out there, and there's a lot of people that need to be fed. So we all went to Phoenix. I think there were 10 or 11 of us in 11 cities. We got together and said we should pool our resources and learn from each other, and we created an organization called Second Harvest. And that became America's Second Harvest. And then 7 or 8 years ago, that became Feeding America. It seems like such a simple idea to take the surplus. In this case, over 30% of what we grow and package in this country is unmarketable but edible. But in the 70s, it was against the law to distribute this food. Also in the 70s was before UPC codes. Does anybody in the room remember that, before they used to scan? I mean, my God, food industry would lose all their food. They didn't know where it was. A simple idea of taking the surplus. That's why we named it Second Harvest, the story of taking the corners of the field and sharing it with those in need. So today we have banks distributing school supplies. We have diaper banks. We have building material banks. We have furniture banks. We even have, here in Atlanta, a tool bank where you can borrow tools for your project. Simple idea, but somebody had to have the first idea. Somebody had to say, I will try that and see if it'll work. So I'll always be thankful for St. Vincent de Paul. I'll always be thankful for John Van Hengel. I'll be thankful, as I've been in this community for 35, 36 years now, that we now have a network of 203 food banks. And this year we'll distribute over 5 billion pounds of food. 5 billion pounds of food. So what I found in creating a soup kitchen was that food, for me more than anything else, but not the only thing, but better for me that food was the place that we could gather. That the table, a real table, but also kind of the metaphor of the table, has always been important. I mean, when we think about the stories and think about Jesus' life, a lot of those stories are around the table. And that the table was a place to engage folks. And of course they ate, they were hungry. They filled their pockets up with food and left because there was no other place to go. But that the table was the place to be with people. For me, more important than doing for people was to be with people. And the idea of starting a food bank was to have more of those tables, more of those places where we would meet to be with each other, to listen, to really find out more deeply what issues were. I mean, being hungry in America, can you imagine if we're throwing away 30% of the food and you're hungry? It really doesn't make sense. We created a movement. I've spoken at a lot of seminaries and trying to get somebody to write that book, so maybe somebody here will. You know, how do you start a movement? How do you sustain a movement? And how could you create a movement around something so simple as a table and a bowl of soup and a sandwich? But today we have almost 80,000 congregations in America serving the hungry. Over 80,000, and many of them are a part of the St. Vincent de Paul network. So that's the place of engagement. We've come a long way. Size and scale has changed. Technology. We're using more systems. At our food bank alone, we use over 200,000 volunteers at the Atlanta Community Food Bank. I can tell you it'd be easier to hire 45 staff people and just get the work done. I mean, all of you are volunteers. You know, they show up, they don't show up, they said they'd do it, then they don't do it. But for me, volunteers, if I have 200,000 of them, they're now on my marketing team. They're now going to go out and tell a story. They're now part of being a food banker. So as you know, in all the programs of St. Vincent de Paul, that the experience of the volunteer is really important because it's their stories that will tell our stories. As we have served the hungry, and the hungry have grown, and we've just been through the worst recession in our lifetime, we have seen things change. The political dialogue has changed. It's a meaner time. You know, there's always been the other. We're always talking about the other. Oftentimes it was Catholics in the world. And even today, Catholics are the other in some places of the world. It's been Jews. It's been Muslims. It's been people of color. It's been immigrants. But today, just being poor represents the other. Like no other time that I've ever experienced. That if you're poor, you're a bad person. This is what we hear. That if you're poor, you're not a good parent. If you're poor, you must be lazy and don't want to work. You know today that over 50% of the people who come to a local congregation and say, I need food, are working. There's something wrong with that picture. If you're getting up every day and keeping your part of the social contract and you still can't put food on the table, there is something wrong. I think that it is our opportunity and our responsibility to not only be the voice for the poor and the outcast, the other, but to be in relationship with them. But not only to be in relationship with them, but to tell their story. That it's our responsibility to change the narrative. Now I know I'm getting in a territory here of politics, and that's an area that we usually don't want to get in. But if God has given us the opportunity to be with and to serve, I think we also have that opportunity and responsibility to tell about the people that we're serving. So it begs the question for all of us, when do we speak up? Do we speak up when somebody's telling a racist or sexist joke? Do we speak up when somebody starts into describing those other folks, people of color, people that are poor, immigrants? It's an awkward moment for any of us. It's a hard moment for any of us. But I would say that not only are we given the opportunity to serve, but we're given the opportunity to be that voice, to tell that story. One of my teachers, and actually became a good friend and somebody you may have heard of, Parker Palmer. I don't know. Parker has been a teacher. He's a Quaker. He's been a teacher for probably 50 years. He's written a lot of books, particularly for educators. He has an organization called the Center for Courage and Renewal. You can Google up Parker tonight when you get home or in your hotel room. Parker talks about living in the tragic gap. Living in the tragic gap. Living in the tragic gap is where all of us live. If we're here today and we're a part of St. Vincent de Paul, we have put ourselves in the tragic gap. And the tragic gap is that space between what we know is possible, what God promises us the kingdom of God will be, even what we know is possible if we would just do what we ought to do, and the reality of what we work in every day. That we can see it, but we can't experience it yet. It's another hard place to be. It's a place that most people don't choose to place themselves because there's no clear answers there. It's when we're called to serve, we've got to be in that gap. And what we've got to talk about is the kingdom of God and what's possible, and we've got to live with the reality that there's hungry people and homeless people, there's depressed people, there's people out of work. And that's our job, to tell that story. So we have to ask, what are the tools today to engage people? You've been together for 3 or 4 days. You had 34, 35 workshops. I'm aware that I'm your 4th keynote speaker. I'm just glad you showed up. I didn't know if anybody would be here. You've learned a lot of best practices. You've gotten a lot of good ideas. But still we're left with, how do we go home and do this? Because at home, we may not have as fertile ground. We may not have the support that others have. St. Vincent de Paul has been a safe, welcoming place. What'd you tell me, John? 170 years? In America, 110 years? I mean, there's a lot of talk today about how do you sustain something. You guys should write the book if you've been doing it for 110 years. St. Vincent de Paul has treated people with dignity. You've done the work of being with and not just for. You've been conscious that we don't know when we're going to be serving Jesus, when Jesus is going to walk in the door, or if Jesus is going to be hungry or depressed or out of a job, confused. We don't know who's going to walk through that door, but we're called to serve them. I would say that when I think about the food bank, we'll distribute about 60 million pounds of food this year. Have 150 staff people. That's great work, and it's a big logistics company. It's about a $100 million company. But because of where I came from the soup kitchen, just like the soup kitchens you run, just like St. Vincent de Paul, that I think of food as that transformational tool. One of the first agencies I served was St. Vincent de Paul. One of the congregations I first served was St. Anthony's Church over in the West End. Betty Knott is one of my dearest friends, and she was running St. Vincent de Paul back then. She's running a St. Vincent de Paul in Australia. Boy, did she fade away. Australia, God, Betty, but we still talk. We still email each other. Transformation happens for those we serve, but we should be very mindful that transformation happens to both the giver and the receiver. If we really go deep of what calls us to this work, it is a longing for transformation. It's a longing to live a more purposeful life. It's a longing to figure out the tools that we can engage people with. So it doesn't have to be food or employment programs or counseling. It can be anything. It can be just being a friend. When we look at how are we going to sustain this work, I don't see many young people in the room. And I don't know if you've had a workshop on it, but as I look at the 650 agencies that we're serving, and we just spent a year going out and talking to them, we see volunteers aging out. We see congregations not having enough resources. We see that it's getting harder and harder to do this work. So that question of sustainability is a big question for all of us. I don't worry about you guys as much. If you've been doing it for 170 years, y'all must know something. But I do worry about the model we've created at the food bank to centralize the acquisition and decentralize the distribution. Meaning decentralizing the distribution means we get the food out into the community. I mean, one of the great things we do with John and St. Vincent de Paul here is that we partner and collaborate. Where we have to pick up hundreds of Kroger stores, John does that and brings the food straight back to St. Vincent de Paul. We've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into St. Vincent de Paul to buy refrigerators and trucks. So as we think about how do we sustain our work, I can tell you that we're going to have to collaborate more. We're going to have to partner with others. We're going to have to define what public-private partnerships look like. A lot of rhetoric by politicians about the private sector will take care of this problem. Did you know when we look at all the money we spend to fight hunger through public programs and private programs, all the 80,000 congregations that are feeding the hungry, and we add up all that, our part in the private sector is about 6%. 6%. That the public is doing 94% when we look at the dollars. Now, I'm not saying that to make us feel small because our work is around transforming lives. It's not just a transaction like a food stamp is. But it is to say that we've got to define what a public-private partnership looks like. John and I talk about this all the time. We strategize in the morning and cry on our beer in the evening, but we do have plans to figure out how we can partner. Let me give you an example. Atlanta Food Bank has a contract for all the TFAP product, all the USDA product for the whole state. And we have that because I went to the governor and said, you guys don't know how to run this business. And I found out what they were paying for a warehouse. They had no inventory system. The trucking company was stealing them blind, and I put that, and you know what they asked? God, how'd you find this out, Bill? It's like, whoa, it's public knowledge that the private sector can do this better. So I would say to St. Vincent de Paul and to the food banks of the world, we're going to have to figure out how to have partners. And we're going to have to partner up. Even though we're a faith community, we're going to have to figure out how to take on more of this work. And we can do it more effectively. We can do it more cheaply. We can serve more people for the same dollar. Now I want to come back, because I let that lay for a minute, but I want to come back to how are we going to engage young people in this work. As a person who grew up in the 60s, who served in the service for 4 years, who served in Vietnam for 2 years, and who came back completely confused about my own values, completely against the war I had just volunteered for. And I was part of that group that was willing to tear it down, burn it down, make it change without having a plan at the other end. I want to say something about the young people that I'm working with today, and John and I have talked about this a lot, and St. Vincent de Paul in Atlanta is drawing young people, that they're much smarter than us. Have you noticed? I mean, not a little bit. They're a lot more connected. I mean, it's just they grew up being connected. So if there's an idea in India or China or the Philippines, they can find that out in a few minutes. I find that they don't carry a burden of being owed anything. Luckily that they grew up without war and without depression, and it has happened more recently. That's huge when you don't have that chip on your shoulder. And the other thing is they all think they're going to be entrepreneurs. So you give them a problem and they say, well, let's start a business. Well, we might call it a ministry, but they would call it a business. But I would tell you that these smart, engaged, connected, empowered young people are going to be part of our future if we're going to survive. And we've got to find a place, and what I would say is we've got to make it cool to do this work. I'm so encouraged as we move in food banking more into fresh food and health and wellness and nutrition. I mean, I'm going to handle 12 million pounds of fresh food this year. But you find out people don't know how to cook. They don't know their fruits and vegetables. If you're on limited income, you go to Burger King because you can buy a lot of calories there. This is something that engages young people. Community garden, farmers markets, figuring out business opportunities. This is something we've got to look at, something we've talked about here in Atlanta. To sustain ourselves, we've got to partner and collaborate. We've got to invite others to the table. We've got to be open to new ideas and new ways of doing things. Never losing track of our values. Never losing track of the moral call to serve, but being open to new ways of doing it. I would dare say in St. Vincent de Paul, if you look 30 years ago of how we were running the centers, we run them different today. And they're going to have to be very different in the future. If we're going to sustain ourselves in the future, we've got to know where we draw our strength from. I tell young people this all the time. One, they're so much smarter than me, but they're still naive. They don't know much about capital. They don't know that we're all in the people business. Whatever business you think you're in a relationship people business. It's what St. Vincent de Paul does so well. I mean, better than anybody I know is being in that relationship business. But we've got to know where that deep well of strength is. Because if you're in this work, and we all have to grapple with that things don't get better. The harder we work, sometimes they get worse. So we can't define ourselves on the world's measure of success. We've got to measure ourselves. Are we answering the call? Are we being faithful to the work that we're called to? Are we inviting others to the table? Are we creating a safe place to have hard conversations? You know, when I talked before about whether you stop a party when you say, that's not funny to me, or that's a racist attitude to me, that we've got to create places where we can have hard conversations, safe places. And we've got to do more storytelling. I wrote an article recently that said, do facts count? Not too much, because we all got our own set of facts. We got our own networks that we watch. We surround ourselves with people that agree with us. It's one of the wonderful things about St. Vincent de Paul is it gets you out in the world meeting all types of people. So creating that safe place in the congregation or at St. Vincent de Paul to have hard conversations is exactly where we are, without knowing where our strength comes from, without knowing a sense of who we are and what our call is, without knowing how we measure our own success, we'll become cynical. And I would say the great dis-ease in America today is cynicism, our disbelief in institutions, particularly government. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, government's so bad you wonder why people run. So when we ask that question of how do we stay strong, how do we not become cynical, how do we not lose hope, we have to dig deep. The opposite of cynicism is not optimism. To counter cynicism in the world is to take action. That's what counters cynicism. That's what counters our disbelief in institutions. Our own church has let us down. Our government has let us down. Friends sometimes have let us down. But if we read the Scripture closely, it doesn't say to stop after somebody lets us down. It says to jump back in and become part of the answer. We're all called to do what we can with what we have in the time we have. St. Vincent de Paul today represents our legacy. St. Vincent de Paul tomorrow will be the legacy of the next generation, which we've got to invite. God bless St. Vincent de Paul for your 170 years of service, for your deep faithfulness. God bless of each of you as servant leaders. God bless your work, your faithfulness, your willing to serve. Each of you represents hope. Hope born of action. Hope born of faithfulness. Hope born of being at the table and being with and not just doing for. God bless you all, and I look forward to talking to many of you later.